Tá, choveu, deve ter entrado água. Não achei. Na hora, esse cheiro de coisa molhada. Coçou o nariz, já era. Você gosta. Sabe o que você quer?
Eu acho que aqui,
rápido, sabe? Eu era o mais próximo daqui, né? Porque tá na pois é. Um mês depois das aulas, como se a gente tivesse aprovado todo, sabe? Mas na nossa especialização, vamos lá, né? Claro, quando a gente agora está com o TCC, então eu quero tirar nota.
Yeah, yes, that's yeah, understand. Okay, that's fine. Then we work it out.
Gente, esqueci de mandar o texto. Porque eu saí daqui com uma reunião, aí quando sai da reunião, estava de mudo, eu saí correndo para esperar.
Mas a culpa é dela, cara. Tem que esperar. Porque eu não paro, eu não.
Ah,
A gente não está agora eu fico de lado, não faz tempo botar, então, eu não costumo, mas assim, vai ter café aqui agora, para compensar que estou meu texto.
Eu sei que
E-mail?
Email, yeah?
Não, e-mail ou WhatsApp?
Email. You want me to WhatsApp?
Não.
I can WhatsApp.
Obrigada. Mais uma mensagem? É, sim.
Dois copos para não ficar tão quente. Mais alguém? Café?
Just got the best milk part of it. Get outside.
Again, welcome. These are the diehards. Come back after lunch on Friday afternoon. Okay. I don't think we're going to be all that long because we're not working without text. So I'm going to perhaps be a little more general. I plan to work with the text, but we're working without, we can just be a little more loose, right? So I'm going to work with ideas of legal subjectivity. So what it is to be a subject of the law. And rather than talk about the text that I wanted to talk about, I'll talk about the theory. So I think that's more easy for you to grasp without having read the article. I'll talk to you about 3 methods that I've used to read historical legal texts. And, you know, potentially, if you want to think about how you can use it to also read contemporary texts, contemporary legal texts, or other historical texts. The basic idea is to look at how the text constructs a subject for the text. For our specific purposes, how does a text construct a subject for the law to enact upon, to create norms around? Or how does the text envision the subject that it is acting upon already, right? So that's the basic idea. Are we online? Yeah? Are there people there?
No. I don't know. The sound.
Is the sound good?
The sound that morning was.
Oh, was it bad?
Yes, very.
So maybe they didn't show up
yes.
again. Okay. So we don't have to worry.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So yeah. Okay, so let's see how we can go. So a lot more informal and a lot more discussion from you then, right? Because we're working. I think just if you've had questions for the past 3 days, the 2 days, questions, any concerns that are coming up, this would be the time and the place. Just open up, yeah. Okay. So let's start with. Okay, I'll give you this as an idea of where I've come from and how I've come to these questions. So you've heard me for 2 days speak about Muslim family law in South Africa, that Muslim marriages are not recognized. One of the key issues during this recognition process, which has yet to happen, was this clause around the nature of the subject, of the capacities, the legal capacities that a Muslim husband and wife would have in a marriage. This is one of the major concerns. So I don't know how well you can see, but on the left-hand side is what the proposed clause was in the bill. On the right-hand side is the amendment made by one of the judicial collectives. So I think you're a bit fast, so you might not be able to read. So shall I read? Can you read it? Yes, you can. Okay. On that side, they're struggling to read it. You can? Sort of. Maybe I make it a little bigger. So there's that, yeah. So basically what it says is that a wife and a husband in a Muslim marriage are equal in human dignity. Then, and that they both have the basis of, on the basis of equality, full status, capacity, On the basis of equality, they both have full status, capacity, and financial independence, including the capacity to own and acquire assets and to dispose of them, to enter into contracts and to litigate. So the amendment that the judicial collective, UCSA is the United Ulama Council of South Africa, the amendment that they proposed essentially took out the centerpiece on the basis of equality, full status, capacity. Right? So this to me was a big concern. To me, this was a question: why are you taking out equality? Why are you taking out full status? Why are you taking out full capacity? This was one of my interests, and so when I did my my project, I ended up looking specifically at legal capacity. How is legal capacity framed in Islamic law, and where does gender feature in the framing of legal capacity? So it's in that context that I was able to develop some reading strategies. How do you read law, which historically doesn't say much about a category woman, or simply takes the normative subject as the free adult sane male? What do we do with laws that are framed in that way? And then the question that I was interested in asking eventually was, so this is the question that I'm asking, right? I've told you where the work began, right? In that space. And then the question I wanted to ask was, who is the woman of Islamic law? So who is the woman of the law? When the law speaks about a woman, who is the law speaking about? And specifically in terms of legal capacity, how does sex difference determine, or what is the place of sex difference in legal capacity? Because I don't like to keep you waiting, some sneak previews into the answers. The answer to who is the woman of Islamic law ended up being, is there a woman? So keep that in mind as we go, because hopefully we'll get there, right? And then the answer about how sex difference features in legal capacity. Two things to bear in mind: that it features situationally, and that it features intersectionally. Right? Keep those two ideas in mind, in terms of situation and in terms of intersection, of intersections. Always very useful to draw on those who've gone before us. Anybody know who this is? I came to theory, desperate, wanting to comprehend. There we go. This is bell hooks. I was supposed to put in the name. Ended up being a nice trick question. So this is the idea. Why do we use theory? Because it gives us ways of thinking, of understanding, of imagining possibilities, right? And so I went into various aspects of theory, various forms of theory. And I really like this phrase, because what Islamic law is something very, very intimate to who I am. Being someone who is a believer, it's not important for me that I follow every law to the letter, but it is important for me that I believe in a system that produces justice, and that I not be involved in a system that creates injustice, especially for people who are me, and all the people who are me, who are living on the margins of society. So for that reason, it is important, and for that reason, there's a hurt. And so I'm interested in making the hurt go away. So a lot of my work is about moving them out of the hurt. And I find theory helps. And I say that because as academics, we're sometimes told not to go into the hurt, or we're reluctant to go into the hurt. But theory can be a way to the hurt, through the hurt, out of the hurt as well. So don't be afraid of it. Sit in it, yeah. Some of the major concerns when we're looking at the subject of law. We spoke about this yesterday or the day before, about the dissonance between expectation that the law will produce justice, and then the lived experience of the law, which potentially produces patterns of injustice over and over again. And which tells us we need a reform of the system. Oh, I'll look at my one. Some of the concerns, a dissonance between the expectations that law will produce justice, the lived experience of the law, which does not produce justice, produces patterns of injustice regularly. And we see this in many of our laws, which tell us that there's space for reform. And so moving with this, I literally, so I'll tell you what I did practically. I was looking for, I was reading text to see where is this Muslim woman subject in a legal text. Now, Islamic law is a rich textual tradition. There's innumerable texts. And so I had to go find where this idea of woman as a legal subject stood. And of course, it wasn't neatly waiting there for me, though I thought it would be. I thought I'd go and I'd see what is a woman, or who is the woman in the law. It wasn't there. What I found was text after text after text of jurisprudence. And I showed you the other day what the jurisprudence texts look like, right? So I showed you what the fiqh text looked like. That's a text of positive law. Then I went to look at the texts of, which come after the text of positive law, which is the text of jurisprudence. And this is interesting. In a system like Islamic law, the positive law, or the actual rulings, come before the science of the rulings. Does that make sense? The law emerges before the jurisprudence. Does that make sense to everybody? That law exists before jurisprudence exists. So rules and norms exist before we get to think about how we made the rules and norms and what the principles are. Though intuitively, it feels like it should be the other way. That you should have the jurisprudence should exist before law. But yet it is law that comes before jurisprudence. So I went into the text of jurisprudence. And in the text of jurisprudence, the top, I don't have a list here of topics, table of content the way I gave you for the books of law. But right at the very end of every jurisprudence text, I found a topic, it was legal capacity. And that was the place eventually where I found a discussion which I thought I could use to understand how the law understood what it meant to be woman. And so I read that text and did not find the concept of woman I expected to find. So I expected the text to say Muslim women are lesser subjects of the law because they are women. That's essentially what I expected. I didn't find that. I found something very different. Right, let me show you what I found. So I found a section on legal capacity. And these were the subheadings in this section on legal capacity. It spoke about, I'll just go one or two back. It said legal capacity came from the idea of a commitment, a covenant between the subject and the divine. When God asked, "Am I not your Lord?" and the person said, "Of course you are." In there was a covenant, an agreement to obey God. And in that agreement to obey God was where the subject was created. Whether the commitment to God, the commitment to conform, to believe, to follow the rules was created when the subject agreed and said, "Yes, you are my God." So that is where legal capacity came from, that first commitment to God. The next place it came from was when the person was born. By virtue of being born, and even prior to being born too, but I won't get into that. But by virtue of being born, the person exists. And so they have certain obligations from society due to them. And then as they grow from a child into an adult, they begin to have obligations due to people. So those are the three elements of legal capacity. However, it said that in this process, there were times where there were impediments to legal capacity, which meant there were certain moments at which you were not held completely responsible for your obligations to society or obligations to each other. And this was the list of when you were not fully obligated. So if you look at the list, there are two types of impediments. The one are God-given impediments, which you have no control over. The other are acquired impediments, which you supposedly have control over. So being a child, you don't have control over that. Being mentally incompetent, being enslaved, being mentally deficient, being forgetful, being asleep, unconscious, being ill, being in a state of menstruation or bleeding, and being dead. You have no control over all of those, right? But in the others list, you have some control. So when you're ignorant of a thing, when you get drunk, when you're joking and you shouldn't be, when you're traveling, all of these. What was interesting for me was between these lists, there wasn't a category woman. So there isn't a thing here for women. There's one thing which is very specific to a female body. Or a body with a womb, that is menstruation and postpartum bleeding. Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I am. Oh, okay. So look at this list, right? So in this list, these are all the things. There's only one thing that speaks specifically to a body with a womb. The rest could apply to anybody. And so, reading through this one section here, I read through it, and this is what it said. It says, look at the second bold piece there. Menstruation and postpartum bleeding do not negate legal capacity. Not the capacity for obligations, nor the capacity to act. And what is said before that and after that is pretty much affirming all of that. But there's nothing beyond that. What it says is that menstruation and postpartum bleeding are impediments to legal capacity because in order to pray and to fast, one's body needs to be ritually clean of blood. The body cannot have blood on it if it's to be ritually clean. And so, because menstruation and postpartum bleeding don't allow you to be free of blood, it means that you're not required to pray, you're not required to fast. So essentially, you're not required to do worship in that situation. But there's nothing about your legal capacities for that the community has obligations to you or you have obligations to others. Your capacity to contract never changes. So this is what I began with, reading this and thinking, wow, what is actually happening here? Because it's not what I expected it to look like. I expected it to look very different. And if you get the article, when you read the article, you're going to see that the article speaks about legal capacity in two ways. One scholar says that there's nothing in Islamic law that says women have less legal capacity. And the other scholar says women have less legal capacity. Now I contest both because I think they're both not correct. And so after having read these three perspectives, this historical perspective, now this text that I'm reading, remember, is a 13th century text with a 17th century commentary. And this is a text that is currently taught in the seminaries to scholars who are becoming judges in Islamic law. So I read this text and then I read those two articles that I sent you. And so he has three different understandings of who the legal subject is, women as legal subjects. So my work, then, I take it all the way back now. So, as I was reading, I found some tools. So the first tool is a tool called Sexing the Subject of the Law. It's where we read legal texts where women appear to be absent in the text. Or where their presence is not generalized. And I have a method that I work with that. Let's just go there. Okay, now let me just tell you about the other two first, then we'll go there. The second is to do something that I call reading for the juristic imaginary. And that is to capture the vulnerabilities and the imagined realities in a text. And when we read in this way, we're looking to read for what the scholar suggests about gender. What is the scholar telling us about? What is this? What can we discern about the scholar's imaginary? The third thing to do is to read for what I call a thick description, to look for complexity, to find dimension and varying aspects, to raise what the fluidities are in the concepts that are being worked with. And we do this because we want to ask about how law produces its subject. Now, law often functions as though it simply acts upon a subject. Yeah. But, and this is from Butler, juridical systems actually produce the subjects that they come to represent through exclusionary practices that do not show. The practices of law that produce the subject often do not show. We don't see the practice that is producing the subject. And it acts as though the subject has always been like that. Whereas my argument is that the law is producing the subject in that way. So legal texts, I say, produce legal subjects, even as they ponder upon them. The legal subject does not exist before or after the text. It is produced within the text. And I think that's a strong theoretical point to hold on to, that legal subjects don't exist before or after the text. Legal subjects actually exist through the text. The text is producing a subject as it is speaking about the subject. So let's go to the first tool, which is sexing the subject of the law. It's a 1970s project. You'll find a lot about it, written about it in the past. I think some of it's being revived now. Yeah. A very theoretical project, arguing that the neutral subject of the law is in fact heavily endowed with masculine characteristics. That the male person is the normative subject of law. And questions whether or how women is included in the concept of the legal person. So here's a way in which I was able to do it. And as I'm talking, think about any legal text that you are familiar with, that you are enjoying, that you're reading. And by legal text, I mean a discussion on law or a code, an actual act, something, think about that, your constitution. So the way we do it is we do 3 readings, so 3 steps. The first time we read a text to see where women are spoken about specifically, right? Exactly where is this text talking only about women? So if I look at the discussion I just spoke to you about on legal capacity from Islamic law, the place where it was speaking specifically about women was in menstruation and postpartum bleeding, you remember. And then there were in that place, on the other subjects on enslavement and minority, it would occasionally speak about women, not as subjects of law, but women would feature when they were talking about what would happen if an enslaved person was to get married, how would they get married? How would an enslaved man get married? For example, it said men who were not enslaved could have 4 wives. Men who were enslaved couldn't have 4 wives, they could have 2. So it spoke about women as people who were married, not as women who were people who wanted to marry. What would be their rights? What would be their legal capacities? Right? So those are the places where it spoke about women specifically. The next thing that you do, once you found women in the specific place of law, is you read to put women into the text. And what that means is, you read the whole text as though women are everywhere. And it's very interesting when you start reading texts like that. Go back and read the text as though women are everywhere, right? And if you're doing it with a feminist lens, it's almost impossible for the 2 readings to look the same. They will not look the same. They will look very different, right? The space between those 2 is where I think we can find the gendered legal subject. We'll find what work gender is doing on the legal subject. So we'll find in that place, we'll come to see where and how women are being spoken about or are being legislated for in that text. That's where I think you'll find it. Go to the second way in which the second reading method, and then I'll do the third, and then I'll stop from there, because I think that's as much as we can take on a Friday afternoon. We are tired. I can feel us tired. So if you've got questions or concerns, you can start preparing them also. So the second reading method is to look for the imagination of the jurists, the juristic imaginary. Now, I take this idea in order to understand who is the subject that is imagined by the jurist. The jurist who's writing that act, writing the legislation. What are they imagining? The jurist who's explaining the jurisprudence. Who is the subject that they're imagining? Mostly there's silence in that place. The woman as a subject, there's little written about it. There's most often silence about the female subject. And I take this idea from Michel Ledoux, actually, the idea of the imaginary. So Michel Ledoux speaks about the philosophical imaginary. Looks at, and so a lot of this method on reading for the juristic imaginary is taken from feminist history of philosophy. Because you must imagine, you would know that the history of philosophy, feminist history of philosophy, is doing the same thing that I'm trying to do. They're looking for women in texts that don't speak about women, right? The philosophers are not speaking as though women are in the whole text. They're silent about women, except when they're very clear that women are not men, right? And we don't hear the other silences. We don't hear women's voices coming through those texts either. So we're looking for places where women are not speaking, and women are not spoken of in general terms, but women are made only specific in certain areas. So Michel Ledoux speaks about the philosophical imaginary, and I moved it on to the juristic imaginary. And the imaginary, she says, is symptomatic of an intellectual and a political elision. The imaginary marks those places within texts where the discourse is unable to admit its founding assumptions, and it must cover them up. It signals a crucial vulnerability within texts and arguments. It's a site for what remains otherwise unspeakable, yet necessary for the text to function. It is what is not said about in the text, but it's what is necessary for the text to do what it's supposed to do, for the text to function, what it wants to do. This is necessary. I'm helped in doing this by the work of Luz Irigaray, when she talks about the grammar of discourse. So how does a discourse come together and present itself? She suggests an examination of the operation of the grammar of each figure of a discourse. And that we do this by looking at the laws or the requirements, the imaginary configurations, the metaphoric networks, and also, of course, what is not articulated. What are its silences? Repeating or interpreting the way in which within a discourse, the feminine finds itself defined as lack, as deficiency, as imitation, or as negative image of the subject. We interpret at each moment the speculum, the way in which the feminine is reflected to us through all these dimensions of metaphor, of syntax, of network, so that we can understand the subject as it is captured within the text. I know it sounds like a lot of words, but honestly, really, you've probably already been doing it. You've already read texts and gone, but this scholar is saying this, imagining a woman to be X, or imagining a child to be X, imagining a Black person to be X. So you've already been doing it. I'm just giving, I think, hopefully a tool for naming what it is that we're doing. So don't get too perturbed if it sounds like it's very complicated. It really isn't. Then the third tool, and I'll stop right after this, is the idea of looking for thick description. Oyewumi speaks about social fact, and it's also helped by the idea of an ideological apparatus, right? So what we're talking about is how do we look at societies within their own world sense? And what Oyewumi does is, you'll recall, she challenges the way in which we use the concept woman. And we take it straight out of a Western biologic of what woman is, and we apply it when we're trying to read African cultures, we're trying to read Islamic law, we're trying to read indigenous healing methods. We take that idea of woman and we transplant it. And she says very clearly we can't do that. We have to look at what is the local logic of gender, of sexuality, of hierarchy, of difference. And from there is where we need to be asking who is or what is, how does gender and sexual difference work in a society? So she alerts us to that coloniality of gender, that we not read gender through a colonial lens, that we are aware and able to read this kind of difference through a lens that is informed by the communities that we want to read with, or that we are reading as. So what this allows us to do is, it gives us this little analytic tool, and she uses it as the idea of the social fact. What are the social facts in the society? What is gender, and what is age, and what is seniority, and what is difference? It means you actually have to know the societies that you're reading. It means if you're going to be reading or making an analysis of Islamic law text, you got to know the community that was reading the text at the time. You got to know the community that's reading the text now. And you got to know their ways of understanding difference. You can't bring to them a way of understanding difference and say to them, this is the way you are doing things. Okay? So it's a little analytical tool to uncover the layers of contingency that I use to read Islamic law. You can't see what's showing up on my screen. Thank God, my sister's talking to me. So, just looking at the next slide, I'm not holding this. So I get to a bunch of conclusions in my work, but I don't think we need to go through that. I don't think it's going to be relevant to you, and I don't think I'm going to relate to it right now. I'm just going to get to the very end of this to talk about what I said to you would be the answers, right? So with these reading methods, what I found was what does determine gender legal capacity in Islamic law, for the legal situations, and I spoke a bit about that the last time. For example, the legal situation wife, right? Marriage seems to be amongst the most significant situations that impact legal capacity. The situation of a woman in marriage is the status of wife. And my argument is that the status functions unannounced, unarticulated in many of the laws, and it is a much stronger category of status than women. Woman doesn't even feature. I'm quite clear that in the historical law, the concept woman doesn't feature. The concept wife features. The legal category woman doesn't feature. There are women in various situations. So for example, there is the category of, if we're looking at marital status, there is the unmarried prepubescent girl, for example. Similarly, the unmarried prepubescent boy. There is the pubescent girl and the pubescent boy. There's the discerning, the pubescent, non-discerning boy, pubescent, non-discerning girl. Pubescent being having reached puberty, having had your menstruation. Or for boys, it's articulated in being able to ejaculate. Boys, that's where puberty is associated in Islamic law. So these are various categories. There's the category, for example, of an adult woman, whether she has been previously married or never married. That will determine the kind of consent that she can or cannot give when she gets into marriage. So these categories exist, but in single category woman doesn't exist. And that was one of my main sort of findings. So what happens when we shift from the category woman to the category wife? Essentially, we move away from woman as an essence or an essential definition. And we move to wife as a situation. So we don't have to define women essentially or categorically. We can define wife as a legal situation. And each wife's legal situation will be different based on her legal marriage or the nature of that marriage, right? We can recognize legal situations rather than biological essentials. And that allows for a multiplicity of legal presence. So we can be legally present in multiple ways. I can be a wife in one context. I can be a property owner in another context. I can be inheriting from my father's estate and inheriting in another context. But I'm not given an essential category, an essentialized legal category of a woman. This allows for this multiplicity and the situationality. It also allows for an application of intersectionality, because it allows it requires that we factor in my age, my sexual status, my religious status, in the classical law, whether I was enslaved or I was free, whether I was adult or child. So it requires an intersectional reading as well. And what it does, I think, most importantly, is that it recognizes that the legal understanding of women is not singular. It's not static. It's not essential. It's not substantial. It moves us away from an essential, singular, static category into a multiple, moving, discursive, situational understanding a category that shifts and moves. Oh, I think I'm done. So yeah, so that is what it does. And that's what I want to, so that's my offering. That if we move away from the category woman, now it's very difficult for feminists to move away from the category woman. But more and more feminists are being asked to move away from the category woman, because the category woman has become essentialized. And we're asked to move to different ways of thinking about gender, sexuality, embodiment, and lived reality of the situation. Oh yeah. Sorry if it was a lot. It's late, I know. I'd love to hear if anything's triggering for you, anything is going ouch or no.
What is this?
So just have comments, not necessarily questions, so share comments. What's it triggering for you? What's it making you think like?
É ruim em inglês, a gente ajuda. Às vezes o problema é só esse. A pessoa quer falar, não tá nem conseguindo uma coisa também.
I'm tired.
No. Restart. Restart. Reboot.
I'm sorry, where's the bar? Save us. Oh, two of you.
Thank you for this presentation. This method that you propose, do you think it applies to another categories like race in another one?
No.
We can work with this. I think that's a very, very good question. I've been so busy working on it around gender and sexuality, I haven't moved there. But maybe we can think about it collectively. Do you want to think about how it might work? Everybody in the room, I don't know, just let's have a discussion. Could it? Would it? If we were to take any of the, say the Constitution, Brazilian Constitution, do you think it could work with race if we read it in this way? So then your project would be racializing the subject of the law.
We can do the same movement, changing women as Black people.
Yes.
But when you propose this kind of, I understood your movement in another sense, because you were provoking us to see that sometimes the woman is characterizing in a simple way as a wife, reduced as a wife, and so we are not changing the notion of category, but engaging with the way that the category of women are mobilized by the law and create a subjectivity by the law. That's it.
So, yes, the category of wife is a stronger category. But, so I think what happens is that if you take a classical law, like Islamic law, and you try to interpret it now, the category we're using now is woman. And my argument is that that's a problematic category to use on a classical law. Because that law doesn't have that category. That law is working with category wife. But it's very clear that that's not the only category of woman that that law has. Wife is one category. So female property owner is another category. Female previously married woman getting married is another person that you see. So these are the people we see. We see women in different situations. We'll see the woman who is the business owner. There's law about what she does or doesn't do. So my idea is that if we put aside the category woman, we can see a lot more complexity in how gender is being dealt with within the law. That gender doesn't become, there isn't simply one way of dealing or addressing or limiting what gender means. It has a lot, there's many more ways, it's a lot more fluid. Yeah.
When Oyemi show us or invite us to read some notions of a woman reduced by wife, I try to make an exercise to see some law with this lens, and we can find here some of them without the name wife, marriage status, and we have an important public policy that don't use this, don't make this reduce. And the effects of this public policy is very important to women. And the most of the women that we have here that are not white. But principally when we are talking about Black women, because the most of the Black women are not white. And the norm that I'm talking about is the norm that the norm that create the Bolsa Família. Social assistance program.
Yes.
Yeah. And when they determine the subject of the law, they use a different notion of family. And the notion of family they used mixed families that the woman is the only chief economic responsible for the surveillance, but they recognize too the other the different ways that poor women have to the different strategies that poor women have to mobilize to maintain the surveillance. So they talk about the familiar unity as I will take the norm. It's better to pegar lá. Mas vai falando aí, gente. Eu estou aqui conversando, mas vocês também estão aqui. Eu posso levar.
Thinking of this while Jill was getting the reference, thinking of this conversation, I was actually thinking about some concepts that we brought up in her talk this morning that could help
think of these possibilities, specifically kinship, but also use a term that I wasn't familiar with, which is being positionally blind. So if we were to think these categories situationally rather than essentially, and then if we were to take, for example, the definition that we use often here of how whiteness works in Brazilian context by Slepen, which talks about whiteness as a way of seeing and living in the world. Okay? And so from that understanding of institutional whiteness, we can see that certain subject positions are produced from places of positional blindness. So for example, talking about class in terms of income, you have to take out a number of variables or intersections with race and others in order to think class as a simple equivalency of one's numerical income, right? Not taking into account the many other class ways that people will have access to capital, to spaces, to networks. So I was thinking about, if we were to racialize the subject of law or to think in other ways, non-essentially, right, that this situational way of understanding connects up with thinking about these subjects, positions, and then kinship is a very non-essentialized way of thinking those relationships and function. We found that it's what's
because we are discussing a different norm for this program after Bolsonaro's government, so this is not the standard that are valid now, but as we're in the transition, but the
Previous one.
And so for the ends of the finality of this law, right, it's considered that family, a nuclear unit, and eventually broadened by individuals who have class, you should say, it's getting into kinship, to have affiliations of like relatives that are related, or have some kind of affinity, that form a domestic group living under the same roof, and that that is maintained by the contribution of its members. So family as a nuclear unit that's broadened by individuals who have affinity or relations that form a domestic group that live under the same roof and are maintained by the contribution.
and it's an exception when we see the norm that protects families or the norm that develops having family as a subject of the right. And of course, you have a lot of limits here, but it's very different between the others that you have to talk about capacity, to talk about inheritance, to talk about transmission of properties, the power across the children. It's very different for me to think about family.
Yes.
We can say a lot of limits here, but here we are not at all. We are not talking about the life.
Yes. Yes.
And the effects of this public policy by women in general, but especially when we are talking about women that are not white, it's very different too in relation to other policies that
Yes.
we have
Because this idea of living under one roof, central in this whole thing, there is a wife. In this idea of family, the way it's being presented.
this one.
Yes.
No,
Do you not see that there's a wife in it? Is that not what you're saying? There isn't a wife in it.
yes, isn't.
There isn't articulated a wife, or there isn't subliminally a wife.
I think we are not thinking in the family that the wife is the principal category.
Not the principle.
You can see family that women are wives.
Mm.
This protection, but other families can be protected too.
Yes. of
You
course,
cannot be a wife to
You don't
be a
have to be,
subject,
yeah,
a subject of law, this law.
yeah.
And the others, you have to, even when
Yes.
they don't see that at more, they don't write that.
Can you
I hear you.
I was thinking about Silva Federici, from Caliban Lewis, about how historically these juridical concepts or these static concepts were also used to make some the development of capitalism by the situation of women. So the wife is used about the development of the economic capitalist way. And by thinking about that, I was thinking here, going a little outside the know, but how can we think about this development of new juridical concepts in a way that it will not create new static juridical concepts? So to be, how can I say, a continuous development of women's rights, maybe made by women in the legislative process or in public policies. How can this be made not to create new imitating juridical concepts, but to be a continuous construction of juridical rights?
I think it also needs to be a continual construction of categories. So even if you're going to be, so I mean, if you're going to be using the category wife, then it can't become a static category of wife. Well, the category wife must be open to whatever is functioning socially as wife. It shouldn't be a predetermined notion of what wife is. And I think just to be clear, in terms of what I'm reading in the historical law, is I'm reading that wife existed. I'm not suggesting that wife continue to exist. But I am saying that if you want to do reform, and that's most of the work that I presented over the past 3 days about reform toward a sense of justice coming out of the law, we have to be cognizant of that category wife, that is what's functioning. It's not the category woman that's functioning. So if you want to do the reform, we've got to reform actually the entire framework of marriage, of Islamic marriage. That is where we need the fundamental reform, that the way in which marriage is conceptualized, who gets married and what is married, all of that has to change. But we can't do any of this reform if we sit in this concept of women. It doesn't work. I think it's almost anachronistic, like it's, you can't take this very contemporary idea of women and put it onto a historical law. And that, for me, in that there's other lessons that we can learn about how we deal, how we analyze, critique and reform traditional spaces. How do we engage with culture and tradition that are functioning now, but we want it to, and we demand that it function in our contemporary categories, but its own categories may not at all be suitable to that. So it's asking for the kind of reform that is actually attentive to what is happening in that space, as opposed to the helicopter reform, which comes and tells you what you need to do now. I think we're tired and done. Thank you, everybody. Are we okay to close, Tuba? Yeah?
Vai, Rebeca. Rebeca tá preparando para.
I was thinking here, and not only about today discussing, but about the yesterday discussing, and how do you see the relation between the Muslims feminists? Because that I believe that we have more than one Muslim feminist. and we are talking about one of the biggest cultural groups, and how do these Muslims, families fight together to build against the rights.
Makes sense, I understood.
Entendeu?
I think I understand. Okay, thanks. It's a very nice question. Yeah, you're getting into the meat of it now. Yes. And so the big thing when we study Muslim women is this idea of Muslim feminism, Islamic feminism, and the idea that you know, there's this massive community of Muslims. There's a large amount of critique, and you are totally correct to say there are now many different strands of Islamic feminist thought. And one of my critiques has been, and you heard it yesterday or the day before, that we have to be careful about how we bring them together. We have to remain constantly interested in the tension between the two and not just pretend like they come together easily, right? At the same time, we shouldn't just blow them apart completely. So there is a large number of Muslim feminist groups all over the place doing their work. I think your question was, how do we bring them together and how do they fight together? So, I mean, technically, they're bringing themselves together. They're fighting in ways that, in yesterday's slide, I gave you some links for NGOs. If you looked at those, so you'll find some of the ways in which they're fighting together. In ways in which campaigns are happening for reform of law. But I think I want to be a little more critical here and ask us about, and we look at Spivak, Gayatri Spivak, Lila Abu Lukhot, ask us what interest we have in Muslim women fighting for their rights. What makes us so interested in Muslim women fighting for their rights? What makes it so important for us to study this and think it must be studied? I don't know if anybody wants to venture an answer. But what makes us think it's so important for Muslim women to fight for their rights? Somebody? Right. Well, I think we think so because we think, gosh, some women are so oppressed, they really need to fight for their rights. And I think then we need to think about who is oppressed and how that oppression is happening. How much of the oppression of Muslim women comes from the idea that Muslim women are oppressed. So to think very carefully about why we think they must fight, and how in that idea that they must fight is the idea that they are already oppressed, and how that takes away their agency from actually living full lives, agential lives, lives with agency for what they're doing. So hope you don't mind me being a little critical, but asking you to think about it that way. Because if we think we're going to go in and save Muslim women, now, what's going to happen to Muslim women is what Muslim women are going to do for themselves, right? It's going to be what they are interested in doing, what they want to do, what they're committed to doing, what they find possible to do in their own lives. And until they're standing there saying to us, come in and do this, they should be doing what they're doing. Yeah. But of course, solidarity is crucial. Solidarity in any movement is crucial, and we must be able and willing, available to give solidarity when it's asked. And also not be lulled into the idea that everything is fine on the other side. No, it is not fine. Where there is obvious oppression and we see oppression and we are asked to come in and work, then we come in and we work. But the idea is just essentially to be guided by the communities that we want to work in, with, at. It's very difficult though, because the nature of our politics right now. And I mean, one wonders what happened to ISIS and all of that in the Middle East. Suddenly it's evaporated. Suddenly that's not the biggest problem in the globe, on the globe. Biggest problem on the globe is now where? Putin is the biggest problem on the globe. So we're not so crazy about saving Muslim women anymore. Now we're crazy about Putin. The politics of it all, I think, is very important just to bear in mind. But of course, to be involved in solidarity and be available to give solidarity when it's asked. Thank you. That's a really, really nice way to end. I appreciate that. Okay. Is there any more? No. Cool.
Thank you so much.
I like everything. I see you. I can see it.
Obrigada, amores. Eu vou mandar depois o texto, tá? Eu esqueci pronto. Chuva. Isso me entenda de novo.
We need some.
Here, if we writes down this.
Tá. Tá. Você tá nessa turma, não?
Vocês vão passar.
Ah, é a minha. Eu já sou com Jesus.
Tchau, tchau, gente.
Thank you so much.
Não é
Capacidade, mas
tudo bom. É capaz de se for onde a Italian way after 21 that was my question. I was asking a professor how he decided that's what I was asking before. Because some of the things that you put in the hands of the ones that we have to get to leaders, like it's so often the real and implies
My intention, yes. It also works in some the same way with intention. Take pictures with the students.
Yes, other students who have universities, might be similar as a classes there.
demora um pouquinho a galera. Já foi embora? Já foi. Eu saí falar talvez pela janela, assim, eu tirar lá para cá, falando da Jéssica. Quando eu bate,
You know about the life.
It's because the window.
The expert, the selfie expert.
Yeah.
All the way to the top, there you go.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Bye.
Thank you.
No,
Thank you.
Do this at 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon. Too long to fix. Wow. No, it's out. Well, we don't come about some town meetings.
Each time should be taken.
Days to get. Não, já quatro anos.
Esse dia não tem. Dá pra chegar lá, nem. De ontem não tinha nada.
Tá.
E aí.
Bom,
Eu tenho que não descer.
tá. Right. Let's see how we did it. 2 days. She's saying I'm not here long enough. I said it's 2 days in and 2 days out.
That's why I spent 2 weeks here.
I might miss my job. Thank you so much. I hope it was what you needed it to be. Yes, it wasn't too far removed.
It was a lot to connect with. Yes. Yeah, my experience the first day was like, it took us out of our those scripts, which has a very didactic function. So we used to talk about the same kinds of questions, and then we don't have a chance to review our methods. Yeah. And then today it really connected that method. That was my impression from the outside.
As long as it's useful, this thing just must be useful for you guys and it's useful for them.
Yes.
Otherwise, what's the? Trigger some ideas and thoughts now or later.
Later, so capacity is not going to get around intention. It's now being breakdown. That's what I was trying to understand. The subjects. It will be facts of the subject's actions.
Well, in some laws, typical capacity to do something in public spaces. It's about intention, especially in commercial spaces. You might have the capacities. What is your intention? To intend to worship, to intend to do an act. That will determine the morality of the ethics of the act. That's a reality. So you were able to do this. So for example, in divorce, when you pronounce divorce, when a husband pronounces divorce, some schools of law, the fact of the pronouncement determines the matter. Other schools of law, the intention alongside the fact determines whether it's determined. So if you were angry and you pronounced it, then in some schools it's not. Other schools it is very. So the intention and the fact, the legal act and the intention work with each other. But intention is goes in hand in hand with legal capacity in terms of those elements that are within our own capacity, our own control. So what is your intention in
in pronouncing talaq when you were joking. So you made a joke and you said in the joke, I divorce you, talaq. What is your intention? That you have control. So you have control of your intention. You should probably joke and say it. You do, it's gonna go.
And I was trying to think of the question, I think, implications and aspirations, subject of law. Because we started talking about that. When intention is central. Processes, racial violence, gender violence, the intention of the subjects. It's different. So that's why I was thinking like that. That's called that method. It's visualizing.
Because when you talk about the personality, the subject of law, we are talking about the standard, the subject of Western subject of law. It is sovereign subject, something. So we have male, white male, and white the race, yes, the race. Between these circumstances, not exactly one side is one standard. But we can do things inside the race. Not only perceptions, things, but other too. Something more that for the depends on that Black people. We can see most of them now. Black people.
That means that I can do anything now because I have to another meeting.
Yes, I too. Now I don't have to think.
Exactly. I don't have to think till Tuesday.
So I don't have the brain capacity to think, but I can do it.
Yes. From what I understood, if see how she is. It's better, we'll have dinner together with her, if not, ourselves.
Yes.
And we're going to cook.
Okay. You can make the rice. What are you gonna eat with the rice?
If it, the new originally, if that works, so I should make things, yeah. Then let's go with the rice.
But it's not.
Yeah, if not, then I can make the rest of the dish I made for that day, which was yogurt and potato, and we'll have some spinach.
I didn't go to the sugar loaf, because the price that sugar.
What on the bush?
I have finished, so.
So that would get
I don't want some. Was there sugar loaf?
Yeah.
So that you need to some off. It's not plenty, it's the priority is peace.
Well, for me,
And so we're a little worried that it's going to rain. So, and I understood, instead of doing a walking circuit tomorrow, that you prefer to spend the tomorrow. And then on Sunday, go to the fourth region, is that right?
yeah, just because it looks like tomorrow's a better, more sunny day than Sunday by the looks of the
Yeah,
forecast.
So what does that mean? Just to give you confidence.
Yeah.
I'll cancel that.
Okay.
Walking circuit. And then on Sunday, I saw that the exhibition at is open, the whole thing is open, so there's a way of us to meet. If you like on Sunday and then lunch there and then come back. last year. That's an option. Thinking about samba, which is one of the things that you said that you're interested in, that would definitely be an option tonight. And if you want something lazier on the bed down, I discovered it very recently, here, very close by. If you go down the channel, the Long Beach, and you go up a little bit, there's a kiosk there that you can have over the fire that you so love and it's a little sense. If you want to have like a quiet time before the sun is a different energy.
Yeah.
So it depends on what you're up for. Other options, if you want like you were asking about Cuba, but I saw that the somebody Cuba usually is on Thursdays. On Friday. But Cuba, it would be okay to eat at Cuba, for example, and go to bed at the Samba Boys for the Samba, because it's all in the center. Oh, and she just saw that the sugar will go to the dates. So if you want, so you have several different options. You know, what your age, if you want quiet time, there's a speech where you can just go and open the waters to the sunset, and from there it's feel up. There's the sugar to go up into the view. There's to go directly to the restaurants. Where there's somebody there. There's three different types of options. Depending on my family.
The options are 5 each for
Yeah,
below.
and the beach between coconut waters is like that chill. That can also be a transition, for example. Yeah, but I didn't realize that it was equal as well. So
So what's your suggestion?
yeah, I was thinking more so the things you've already put on the table, trying to make them easier, but.
I'm an organizer, by the way. It's so good at just pulling it all together, you know.
I only can't go to the sun.
That's later.
Yes. I stay until summer starts.
You want to do sugar? You decide if you want to do sugar with you or if you want to do something with you.
Yeah, I'm looking at the part. What's sugar? I'm going along.
What?
What's the sugar along by myself?
Is it okay to go along to the sugar? Yeah. Did you do sugarloaf and samba?
Yeah. Yes.
Sugarloaf. And what else? It's in between, yeah.
I come, I might not go up, I might stay at the beach down.
Oh, there's a pad down at the bottom?
Well, wait for you to go up and down.
No, I took it.
Are you thinking? Want to eat some point?
We just ate, yeah.
And we can even eat that, which is also.
See, there's a summer place.
From one. It's really expanded. Now I said now there's stores and like a cultural center. It's really good. It's really And I don't want to stop peak tourist season, so I don't think we'll be long lines. Actually, no. There's also a boardwalk you can walk.
We can see.
That's
It's too busy.
yes, yeah. See? Alright. So should I cancel then the reservations for walking?
Yeah,
And then we'll play by ear Sunday whether Portland is interesting or not.
because I see the morning is clear, looks like the morning is
Yeah,
a rain chance, so thinking if I get up early.